Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is going to be a wrap up of all of the nonfiction that I read in November and December of 2024. I don't normally do wrap ups for my fiction books because I go into a lot of detail in my vlogs and stuff like that, but because I don't vlog my nonfiction books and I'm trying to read more, especially this year in 2025, I am going to try not every month, but every other month, something like that, to have a nonfiction book wrap up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. In November and December, I ended up reading 4 nonfiction books, so let's talk about them. The first book that I read in November was The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. This was published in 2023, and boy oh boy, unfortunately, it was a very unfortunately or like very relevant timed book to read in November. This one is all about the Christian nationalist movement and how the evangelical movement has kind of come to a crossroads where there is like evangelicalism and then there is Christian nationalism, which are two very different things. Tim Alberta comes at this from a very personal point of view. He is a reporter, but his father was an evangelical minister, a preacher for the majority of his life. So he has kind of an in to this world that makes it very fascinating and eye-opening, because this makes it, I feel like it makes it easier for him to go undercover into these spaces and interview a lot of people who may not have agreed to an interview with another interviewer. This, however, of course, does make it a little biased. Tim Alberta definitely talks about his reasons for why this is such an important topic for him to report on, and those are very personal reasons. So obviously with that comes bias. I believe he doesn't say what branch of Christianity he still believes in, but it is clear that he still believes in something along these lines, not the nationalism, the Christian nationalism part of it, but the maybe potentially evangelical Christianity part of it. So those are some biases to know going in, but he is very upfront about his stakes within the church, and I think that's also why that makes this book very compelling, because he's coming at this from a place where he's not anti-religion, he's not anti-Christian, and he wants better for the church. He wants people to actually love thy neighbor and follow the teachings of Jesus. So while this did lend strength to the reporting and really encourage him to get information that I feel like a lot of people wouldn't be able to deep dive down to get, I feel like it also left a lot of things, like he was a lot kinder towards maybe assuming some people's intentions than other people would, just because of his biases. And then also just sometimes things are a little preachy, for lack of a better word, just in terms of things that maybe evangelicals believe in and also Christian nationalists believe in. So be aware going into this one. This one, I will say my biggest problem with this book is that Alberta, a lot of his argument seems to be that the behavior that white nationalists are perpetuating, the problem with it is that it's holding people back from being evangelicalized or being brought into the church, and not because those are harmful beliefs, if that makes sense. Like, sometimes it just seemed like, hey, if you toned down these aspects, more people would be religious, whereas I think the problem with some of these very anti-queer, anti-black beliefs, for example, those are not beliefs you should be toning down. Those are beliefs that people in this religion should be eradicating altogether and making it clear that it's not one large tent for evangelicals, but these are not evangelical teachings. This was very well researched. This was very eye-opening in seeing the thought processes of people who, you know, full disclosure, do not think like me, do not believe the same things as me, but it was very helpful in realizing what leads people to be drawn into this and what leads people who were not always like this to really get whipped up into a political fervor in terms of their religious beliefs. I will say the Liberty University stuff, I feel like that could have been its whole entire book. I feel like that was kind of a tangent within this greater book that's focusing more on the greater sphere of evangelical Christianity, but that was interesting. I just thought you know, that could have been its own book because it was a very interesting detour, but it did, I feel like, detour from the overall how it wanted to focus on the entire movement and not just certain subsets of the movement. So overall, I did think this was a very eye-opening read. I would say the target audience for this one, you know, maybe someone who is religious, who is evangelical and is worried about these things within their church and worried about these new viewpoints. Maybe someone who is worried about prior church members that have gone to different congregations and wondering what made this very rapid fire change, potentially maybe never Trump Republicans or never Trump Christians. I think that this would be a really eye-opening book. Like I said, I do think it is impactful and very insightful for someone who is just like, how can someone who is claiming to follow the teachings of Jesus, which is a very pacifist, non-militant teaching, how does point A go from point B? I thought that was fascinating as well. Just overall for me, some aspects of the book were just a little too preachy, in particular about queer people and abortion as well. So that was the first book that I read these past 2 months. The next book that I read, I believe this was the tail end of November, was On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. This came out in 2017. This is actually the shortest book of all 4 of these, and honestly, by far my favorite. This is a guide to preserving democracy and resisting the forces of tyranny. It's very short. The audiobook is only about 2 hours, and with the way that this is set up and the way that it's written, it is very easily accessible for a lot of people to read. It's a very non-daunting nonfiction. So in this book, it's divided into 20 short chapters, and each chapter is a specific lesson on how to resist tyranny on an individual level. This book is very hopeful, and I feel like a really good read for people who feel very overwhelmed and feeling like you as an individual citizen cannot enact any change, can't make a difference. I think this is a really great book for reading these 20 steps and realizing that every single person is in fact important, and you individually can do things to make this world a better place. It's very hopeful in that scenario. It's very upfront about the dangers of tyranny and the way in which certain countries backslid into fascism and other aspects of tyranny, and how individual citizens can fight back. This is very helpful. It gives concrete actions for people to take, like for example, do not comply in advance is the name of one of the chapters, and it also gives clear examples from different countries to help illustrate the points and the arguments that this book is making. This book is not only short, but it's written very clearly, very concisely, and it's very accessible. This is really important in a nation where the population is becoming less and less educated. That is just a fact. The reading level, the reading comprehension level of the average American is becoming lower and lower, and having a book like this where there are still some very heavy and very intellectual concepts, and it's not dumbed down, I wouldn't say, but just the writing is very accessible. It's very easy for people to understand and make comparisons here. I would say the audience for this one, the target audience for this one, is adult citizens in nations where perhaps you are worried about the direction in which your country is taking, and I think the audiobook is a great listen, and also just because it's so short, this is a very accessible read. If you want to get into nonfiction and you are worried about, you know, they can be very thick at times, they can feel very inaccessible, so I would highly recommend this one. The next book I read around the beginning of December, and that is Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement by Angela Davis. This one came out in 2015, but it was a collection of previously released interviews, speeches, and articles about these topics. I will say this is not my preferred reading experience for nonfiction in particular, just because I felt like the essays in here were a lot stronger than the interviews. Some of the interviews and the speeches, it just felt weird to me I tried initially to listen to this as an audiobook because I thought that would be a good way to go about it, but it is just, you know, the one narrator reading back and forth the interviews, which feels, it didn't help me absorb the information information. And then the speeches are not like read like a speech, they're read like an audiobook narration. So I did end up switching to the physical book, which helped with a lot of what I didn't like about this one. But honestly, for this one, I enjoyed the essays. I would have preferred, I think, to look up the individual speeches in particular. I don't know if the interviews were ever filmed, but the speeches in particular, they're much stronger, they're much more impactful watching them being presented as a speech rather than reading the speech. So that was my biggest complaint with this one, was just the format, not the content. The content was great, just the format left a little to be desired for me for this one. I would almost recommend picking up a physical copy and then doing a very immersive reading experience, where if you see that it is a televised interview or a speech, that you go on YouTube or something and watch that speech instead of reading it. I think that'll be the way to go for this one. This book overall, it's arguing for a collective global liberation, and it really explores the connections between events like Ferguson and events that are happening in Palestine. It's discussing the militarization of police forces, how Israeli police helped train US police, and just the militarization of police forces globally and how that's a problem, and really connecting these concepts in a way that really imparts upon the reader that our struggles are all connected. Just because we don't live in Palestine, or specifically me, like I don't live in the Ferguson area, doesn't mean that those tactics, techniques, things that are happening, ideas that caused those events to happen, that those aren't also like where I live. So I thought this book did a great job connecting those concepts together. I will say, if you don't have like a base level knowledge of Palestine and Palestine's history and what exactly happened in Ferguson, this might be very confusing. I would say the target audience for this book is for people who already have, like, you don't have to have a ton of knowledge, but just a baseline of what happened in these specific instances, because it does talk a lot about ramifications and the consequences of these events. And if you don't know what the events are, I think that'll be a little confusing. So overall, I did appreciate what was being taught and what was being explained here. I didn't really love the execution for this one. And then last but not least, the last nonfiction book that I read in 2024 was How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. This book came out in 2019. If you are picking this up, I would recommend you do not pick up the hardcover. You either pick up the paperback that specifically has the like sticker on the front that says with a new introduction and notes by the author, or the audiobook, because there were things that were added into later editions that I feel like adds more to this book. For this book, I think the biggest like very nitpicky complaint that I have about this book is that the title does not feel like very accurate to what this book is about. When you read a title like How to Be an Anti-Racist, just in terms of how the words how to are like expected, I guess, in the English language, when you read a article title that says how to make a cake, you're expecting like concrete steps on how to make a cake. This is not like step 1, step 2, step 3 on how to be an anti-racist. So the title, I feel like, is a little misleading. It is catchy though. I understand why they put that in, but this is more exploring anti-racism and racism as concepts and not as fixed identities. So it's really diving into the history of those terms. With anti-racism being a concept, and this is a direct quote from the book, that points us toward liberating new ways of thinking about ourselves and about each other, whereas racism creates false hierarchies of human value. This book starts at the very beginning, the very rudimentary racism versus anti-racism, and kind of giving the definition and what those terms mean, and then really build up on different sections of our society and how these ideas permeate and can influence every single factor of society, race, class, gender, economics, upward mobility, all of that. So it starts very boilerplate and grows into more abstract concepts, which I felt was really nice. It really brings you in and just helps you build upon those levels and explore those concepts. And this really goes over a lot of very important like terminology that I feel like gets thrown around a lot, and really explores what they are, what they mean, and the context of what those terms are. The biggest takeaway from this one is that anti-racism and racism are not fixed identities. I feel like when this book was very popular in 2020, a lot of white people pushed back saying, well, I'm not racist. Like, I don't want to read this book. I don't want to read a book that makes me feel bad for being white. And that's really not what this book is at all. This book is very hopeful about the future of humanity and the future of the end of racism, and exploring the fact that just because maybe you do something racist, that does not mean you're racist. That does not mean you're a bad person, but you just did a racist action. So exploring that and using not only like textbook definitions, but also the author's own experiences as learning techniques to show how these, even as a Black man, how Kendi also his own had racist beliefs and things that he had to confront within himself. When we know better, we do better. This is very educational, and I do think it's very hopeful. I don't think, I mean, I'm just speaking as a white person. This is not a book that made me feel bad for being white. It really made me dig down and realize just how intrinsic a lot of racist policy is, and how it influences and impacts the United States and really seeps into pretty much all of our culture and day-to-day life. So I thought exploring that was really fascinating. I feel like a lot of things are touched on. There were a couple of sections too that stood out as like very fascinating for me, like Ebonics. That was a very interesting section of a chapter to read about. And then also the SATs and the way that they were created and the way that they were specifically designed to shut people out of higher education. I thought this was just a wildly informative book. Audience for this one is going to be a Western, primarily American audience, because this book does focus on America, particularly the United States of America. But I did think if you do live in the US of A, then I think this would be a very informative book. I would recommend the audiobook again or the paperback version with those notes, because it really does illustrate the example that we're all constantly learning and growing for the better. So those are the 4 books that I read in November and December. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. Maybe let me know what your favorite nonfiction book was that you read in 2024. Subscribe to my channel for all of the bookish, horror, and cozy gaming content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!